William Hartwell owned everything a man could want in the Kansas Territory of 1879. His Circle H ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of prime grassland, his cattle herds numbered in the thousands, and his bank account in Dodge City held more gold than most men would see in 3 lifetimes. At 32, he commanded respect from every rancher, banker, and politician from Topeka to the Colorado border. Yet, as he stood on the wide porch of his sprawling ranch house, watching the endless prairie grass wave in the evening wind, Will felt as isolated as a man marooned on a desert island. Trust was a luxury William Hartwell had never been able to afford. Orphaned at 12 when his parents died in a wagon accident, he had built his empire through cunning, hard work, and an absolute refusal to depend on anyone. Every friendship had been tested by greed, every business partnership had ended in betrayal, and every romantic entanglement had revealed itself to be motivated by his wealth rather than genuine affection. Over the years, he had constructed walls around his heart as carefully as he had built fences around his land. The latest test of his suspicions had arrived 3 weeks ago in the form of Ayanna, a young Apache woman carrying a 2-year-old son on her hip. She had appeared at his kitchen door during a thunderstorm, drenched and desperate, speaking broken English and gesturing toward her hungry child. Most ranchers would have turned away a Native American woman without a second thought, but Will's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had taken one look at the frightened mother and insisted they provide shelter. Just for the night, Mrs. Patterson had declared, bustling the woman and child inside before Will could object. Christian decency demands it, but one night had stretched into 3 weeks. Ayanna proved useful around the house, cleaning with meticulous care and helping in the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the demanding Mrs. Patterson. She spoke little, kept her dark eyes downcast when Will entered a room, and seemed to exist in a state of constant alertness, ready to flee at the first sign of hostility. Will found himself studying her with the same calculating attention he gave to potential business deals. What did she really want? Was she gathering information about his wealth to share with other tribal members? Was she planning to steal something valuable and disappear in the night? His suspicious nature insisted that no one did anything without an ulterior motive, especially not someone from a group that had every reason to hate white settlers. The child, a boy named Keme, who appeared to be about 2 years old, had large, solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. He rarely cried, clinging quietly to his mother's skirts and watching Will with the same wary attention that Will directed toward them. The boy's presence only deepened Will's confusion. Why would a woman traveling alone risk her child's safety unless she was running from something or toward something specific? She's trouble, mark my words, Will muttered to himself as he watched Ayanna hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her movements graceful despite the obvious fatigue in her slight frame. They always are. But even as he spoke the words, something about the tender way she adjusted little Keme's position on her hip, or how she paused to smooth his dark hair when she thought no one was watching, stirred an unfamiliar emotion in Will's chest. He pushed the feeling away with practiced determination. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness had no place in his carefully ordered world. Tonight, he had decided, he would put his suspicions to the test. Mrs. Patterson had retired early with a headache, leaving Will alone in the house with Ayanna and her son. If the woman had ulterior motives, this would be the perfect opportunity for her to reveal them. He would pretend to sleep by the fireplace and watch to see what she really did when she thought herself unobserved. As darkness fell over the Kansas prairie and the house settled into nighttime quiet, Will positioned himself in his leather chair near the stone fireplace, tilting his hat low over his eyes, but leaving just enough gap to observe the main room. Through half-closed lids, he watched Ayanna settle her son on a blanket in the corner, then begin her usual evening routine of tidying the already spotless room. He was ready to catch her in whatever deception she was planning. What he was not prepared for was the possibility that the person being tested tonight might be himself. The grandfather clock in Will's front hall chimed 9 times as he settled deeper into his leather chair, adjusting his position to appear naturally asleep while maintaining a clear view of the room through his barely parted eyelids. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the polished wooden floors and expensive furnishings that proclaimed his wealth to anyone who entered his home. Ayanna moved about the room with her characteristic quiet grace, straightening cushions that were already perfectly arranged and dusting surfaces that showed no trace of dirt. Will noted with grudging admiration how she managed to accomplish her tasks without making the slightest sound that might disturb what she believed to be his slumber. Even little Keme, now settled on his small blanket in the corner, played silently with a carved wooden horse that Will's late father had made decades ago. For the first hour, nothing happened that aroused Will's suspicions. Ayanna simply went about her normal evening routine, occasionally checking on her son and adding another log to the fire when the flames began to die down. She moved through his expensive possessions, the silver candlesticks on the mantel, the gold pocket watch he had left on the side table, the leather-bound books that represented his self-taught education, without showing the slightest interest in their monetary value. As the clock chimed 10, then 11, Will began to wonder if his test would reveal anything at all. Perhaps Ayanna was simply too cautious to act while he was in the same room, even if she believed him to be sleeping. He shifted slightly in his chair, letting out a soft snore to reinforce the illusion of deep sleep, and continued his patient observation. It was nearly midnight when something changed. Little Kami had fallen asleep on his blanket, and Ayanna sat beside him for a long moment, stroking his dark hair with infinite tenderness. When she finally rose, instead of retiring to the small room Mrs. Patterson had prepared for them, she approached Will's chair with steps so soft they barely registered on the wooden floor. Will's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment when her true intentions would be revealed. Through his carefully controlled breathing and half-closed eyes, he watched her draw nearer, ready to spring into action if she attempted to rifle through his pockets or steal something valuable from the nearby tables. But instead of reaching for his belongings, Ayanna paused beside his chair and did something that left Will completely unprepared. With movements so gentle they were barely perceptible, she reached down and carefully adjusted the blanket that had slipped from his shoulders, pulling it up to ensure he would stay warm through the cool Kansas night. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely contrary to what he had anticipated, that Will had to fight to maintain his pretense of sleep. No one had tucked him in or worried about his comfort since his mother's death 20 years ago. The simple kindness of it struck him like a physical blow, but Ayanna was not finished. Moving to the side table where he had carelessly tossed his work shirt before dinner, she picked up the garment and examined it in the firelight. Will watched in amazement as she produced a needle and thread from somewhere in her dress and began to carefully sew the missing button that had been bothering him for weeks. Her fingers worked with skilled precision, creating tiny, perfect stitches that would hold far better than anything Mrs. Patterson's arthritic hands could manage. As she worked, the firelight played across her delicate features, revealing a face that was younger than he had initially thought, but marked by hardships he could only imagine. There was concentration in her expression, but also something else, a quiet satisfaction in performing this small service, as if caring for others brought her genuine joy rather than mere obligation. When the repair was complete, Ayanna folded the shirt carefully and placed it exactly where she had found it. Then, in a gesture that stopped Will's breath entirely, she looked toward his supposedly sleeping form and smiled, not the careful, guarded expression she wore during their daylight interactions, but a genuine smile of tender affection, as if his well-being truly mattered to her. The smile lasted only a moment before she turned and moved quietly back to her son's side, settling onto her own small blanket for the night. But its impact on Will was profound and lasting. In that single expression, he saw something he had convinced himself did not exist: pure, selfless care offered without expectation of reward or recognition. As the fire died down to glowing embers and the house fell into complete silence, Will remained motionless in his chair, no longer pretending to sleep, but truly unable to rest. The test he had designed to expose Ayanna's hidden motives had instead revealed something far more disturbing: the possibility that his own cynical worldview might be fundamentally flawed. For the first time in 20 years, William Hartwell lay awake not because he was planning his next business move or worrying about potential threats to his empire, but because a simple act of kindness had shaken the very foundation of everything he believed about human nature. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Kansas prairie, but Will had not slept a moment. He remained in his chair by the dying fire, wrestling with emotions and thoughts that refused to settle into any familiar pattern. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ayanna's gentle smile and felt again the shock of her unexpected kindness. The simple act of covering his feet and mending his shirt had accomplished something that years of successful business, deals, and accumulated wealth had never managed. It had made him question the fundamental assumptions upon which he had built his life. When Ayanna rose with the first light, moving carefully to avoid waking her son, she found Will already stirring in his chair. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and he saw her cheeks flush with embarrassment, as if she feared he might have somehow detected her midnight ministrations. She quickly looked away and began her morning routine, building up the fire and preparing for another day of quiet. "Efficient service?" "Good morning," Will said softly, his voice rougher than usual from his sleepless night. "Did you rest well?" Ayanna nodded without meeting his eyes, but he caught the slight smile that touched her lips at his considerate inquiry. It was a small thing, but it told him that his simple courtesy meant something to her, perhaps because she was accustomed to receiving so little of it from the white world. Over the following days, Will found himself observing Ayanna with new eyes. Where before he had searched for signs of deception or ulterior motives, now he began to notice the countless small ways she made his household run more smoothly. She anticipated needs before they were expressed, repaired things that were broken before anyone complained about them, and treated every object in his home, from the finest silver to the most mundane cooking utensil, with careful respect. More importantly, he began to see how she interacted with her son. Kemi was a remarkably well-behaved child, but Will now understood that this was not due to fear or harsh discipline. Instead, Ayanna guided her son with patience, consistency, and an endless supply of gentle affection. She taught him words in both Apache and English, showed him how to help with simple tasks, and never seemed to lose her temper even when he was fractious or demanding. "She is good woman," Mrs. Patterson observed one afternoon as they watched Ayana teaching Keme to collect eggs from the henhouse. "I have never seen anyone work so hard to earn their keep while asking for so little in return." Will nodded thoughtfully. "What do you know about her situation? How did she come to be traveling alone with a child?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew somber. "From what little she has told me, her husband died in some kind of conflict with soldiers last winter. Her family's band was scattered, and she has been trying to find relatives who might take her and the boy in. She is, how do you say, between worlds. Not welcome in white settlements, but no longer safe in Apache territory either." The revelation hit Will like a physical blow. All his suspicions about Ayana's motives suddenly seemed petty and shameful. She was not scheming to take advantage of his wealth. She was simply a young mother trying to survive in a world that offered her precious few options. The fact that she had maintained her dignity, kindness, and gentle nature despite such hardships spoke to a strength of character that humbled him. That evening, as Ayana put Keme to bed and began her usual routine of tidying the main room, Will made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of retreating to his study or finding reasons to avoid her company, he remained in his chair by the fire and attempted something he had not done in years, genuine conversation. "Ayana," he said carefully, testing the pronunciation of her name, Would you sit with me for a moment? I would like to talk with you, if you are willing." She paused in her work, clearly surprised by the invitation. After a moment's hesitation, she approached his chair and settled gracefully on the nearby stool, her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed on the fire rather than his face. "Mrs. Patterson tells me you are looking for family," Will began, struggling to find the right words. "I want you to know that you and Keme are welcome to stay here as long as you need. Not as servants, but as guests, as people under my protection." Ayana's dark eyes lifted to meet his, and he saw surprise, gratitude, and something else. A wariness that spoke to how rarely she had received such offers without conditions attached. "You are kind, man," she said softly, her English careful but clear. "But I do not understand. Why you help me? What you want from Ayana?" The question was so direct, so honest, that Will felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little further. "I want nothing," he said, and realized as he spoke the words that they were true. "Perhaps I have learned that kindness does not always have a price. Perhaps you have taught me that." For the first time since her arrival, Ayana smiled at him directly, without reservation or fear. It was like watching the sun rise over the prairie, beautiful, transformative, and full of promise for the day ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Will's midnight revelation, and the atmosphere of his ranch house had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. Where once there had been careful formality and unspoken suspicion, now there existed something warmer. Not quite friendship yet, but the beginnings of mutual respect and understanding. Will found himself looking forward to the quiet conversations he and Ayana shared in the evenings after Keme was asleep. Their talks ranging from practical matters of ranch life to deeper discussions about their different worlds and experiences. Ayana's English improved daily, and with it came glimpses of the intelligent, thoughtful woman she truly was beneath her protective shyness. She spoke of her people's ways with a quiet pride that impressed Will, describing traditions of harmony with the land that made his own methods of cattle ranching seem crude and wasteful by comparison. In return, he shared stories of building his empire from nothing, though he began to question whether accumulating wealth and land truly constituted the kind of success worth celebrating. "In my people's way," Ayana explained one evening as they sat before the fire, "we measure rich man not by what he keep, but by what he give away. Man who share much, who help others, he is truly wealthy." The concept was so foreign to Will's experience that he initially dismissed it as naive idealism. But as he watched Ayana interact with everyone from Mrs. Patterson to the visiting ranch hands, he began to understand what she meant. Despite having nothing of material value, she enriched every life she touched through small acts of service, kindness, and genuine care for others' welfare. Little Keme, too, was blossoming in the stable environment of the ranch. The boy's natural curiosity, no longer suppressed by constant vigilance and fear, emerged in delightful ways. He followed Will around the property during his daily inspections, asking endless questions in his mixture of Apache, English, and expressive gestures. Will found himself explaining everything from why cattle needed different pastures in different seasons to how windmills drew water from deep underground. "Papa Will," Keme said one afternoon, the casual endearment catching Will completely off guard. "Why horses wear shoes but cows no shoes?" The innocent question came as they stood watching the ranch's blacksmith shoe Will's favorite stallion, and Will realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, this solemn little boy had begun to see him as a father figure. The realization filled him with an unexpected warmth, followed immediately by a stab of protective anxiety. What would happen to Keme and Ayana when they eventually found her family and moved on? The thought of losing them both had become almost unbearable. That evening, Will made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. As he and Ayanna sat in their usual spots by the fire, he cleared his throat nervously and broached a subject that had been weighing on his mind. "Ayanna, I have been thinking about your situation," he began carefully. "Have you considered that perhaps you might want to make a permanent home here? Not as hired help, but as part of the family?" She looked up from the mending in her lap, her dark eyes wide with surprise. "You mean, stay always? Keme and me?" "I mean more than that," Will said, his heart pounding as he took the biggest risk of his carefully guarded life. "I mean that I would be honored if you would consider becoming my wife. A real marriage built on respect and affection. Keme would be my son in every way that matters." The silence that followed was so complete that Will could hear his own heartbeat. Ayanna set down her sewing and stared into the fire, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You say this because you feel sorry for Apache woman with no family? Because you think Ayanna has no other choice?" Will leaned forward in his chair, desperate to make her understand his sincerity. "I say this because in these past weeks, you and Keme have brought something to my life that I did not even know was missing. You have shown me what kindness without conditions looks like, what it means to care for someone else's welfare above your own. I have lived 32 years without understanding what home really means, and now I cannot imagine this place without you both in it." Ayanna turned to look at him directly, studying his face with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. White man's world not kind to Apache wife. People in town, they say bad things. Make trouble for you, for your business. "Let them," Will said firmly. "I have spent my entire life caring what other people think, building walls to protect myself from their judgment and their greed. You have shown me that there are things more valuable than reputation or social approval. If people cannot accept the woman I choose to love, then their opinions are worthless to me." The word love hung in the air between them, and Will realized with some amazement that he meant it completely. Somewhere in the gentle rhythm of their shared evenings, in Ayanna's quiet care for his comfort, in watching her patient devotion to her son, he had discovered feelings he had not believed himself capable of experiencing. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, then reached across the space between them to place her small hand over his much larger one. "I think about this," she said softly. "His big decision. Not just for me, but for Keme also. He begins to love you like father. If we stay, if we become family, it must be forever. My people, we do not break promises to family." Will squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how perfectly it fit within his own. "Forever sounds exactly right to me," he said. "Take all the time you need to decide. Whatever you choose. You and Keme will always have a home here, and my protection, for as long as you want it." As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to glowing embers, Will reflected on how completely his life had changed. The man who had trusted no one and needed nothing from anyone had discovered that his greatest wealth lay not in his bank account or his vast holdings, but in the possibility of sharing his life with two people who had taught him the true meaning of family. The Kansas spring of 1880 arrived with unusual violence, bringing torrential rains that turned the normally placid creeks into raging torrents and transformed the prairie into a sea of mud. For 3 days, water poured from the sky in sheets, driving cattle to higher ground and keeping all the ranch's inhabitants confined to the house. Will paced the front porch like a caged animal, watching his carefully maintained property disappear under floods of muddy water while worrying about livestock scattered across 15,000 acres. Inside the warm, dry house, however, a different kind of storm was brewing. The enforced intimacy of being trapped together had accelerated the growing feelings between Will and Ayanna, but it had also brought them face to face with the practical complications of their different worlds. When a neighboring rancher, Jefferson Crawford, arrived seeking shelter from the worst of the storm, his reaction to finding an Apache woman and her child in Will's home made the challenges of their situation painfully clear. "Hartwell, what in blazes are you thinking?" Crawford demanded, shaking rain from his coat while staring at Ayanna with undisguised hostility. "Harboring Indians in your house? Have you lost your mind completely?" Will felt his jaw clench with anger, but before he could respond, Ayanna quietly gathered Keme and withdrew to the kitchen, her dignity intact despite the obvious insult. Her graceful retreat only intensified Will's fury at his neighbor's rudeness. "That woman and her son are my guests," Will said coldly, "and they will be treated with respect in my home. If you cannot manage that courtesy, Crawford, you are welcome to continue on through the storm." Crawford's face reddened with indignation. "Your guests? Will, be reasonable. These people are savages. They killed my brother-in-law down in Oklahoma just last year. You cannot trust them, especially not in your own home with all your valuables." The words hit Will like physical blows, not because he believed them, but because they represented the wall of prejudice and hatred that would always stand between Ayanna and acceptance in white society. For the first time since proposing marriage, he began to truly understand what he was asking her to endure if she chose to stay with him. That evening, after Crawford had reluctantly accepted a bed in the barn rather than share roof space with Indians, Will found Ayanna standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. Keme played quietly at her feet, building houses from wooden blocks that Will had carved for him. "I am sorry for Crawford's words," Will said quietly, approaching her with careful steps. "He is an ignorant man who speaks from fear and prejudice." Ayanna turned to face him, and Will was startled to see tears glistening in her dark eyes. "He speaks what many people think," she said softly. "Ayanna knows this. In white man's world, Apache woman always be, how you say, outsider. Even good white man like you cannot change this." Will felt his heart breaking at the resignation in her voice. "Ayanna, please do not let one man's hatred poison your thoughts about our future. There are good people in the world, people who will judge you by your character rather than your heritage." She shook her head sadly. "You are kind, man, Will. Too kind, maybe. You see world how you wish it to be, not how it is. Your friend Crawford, he not only white man who think this way. If Ayanna become your wife, people say bad things about you. Maybe hurt your business. Maybe worse." The rain continued to pound against the windows, and Will realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the tempest of emotion raging in his chest. He had been naive to think that love alone could overcome the deep-seated prejudices of their society. Yet the thought of losing Ayanna and Keme because of other people's hatred was unbearable. "Let me tell you something," Will said, moving closer until he could take her hands in his. "I spent 20 years building walls around my heart because I believed the world was full of people who would hurt me if I let them close. You showed me that I was wrong about that. You showed me that kindness and trust are possible, even between people from different worlds." He paused, struggling to find words for the depth of his feelings. "I would rather face a lifetime of narrow-minded fools like Crawford with you beside me than spend another day in the lonely fortress I built for myself. Yes, there will be challenges. Yes, some people will never accept us. But there will also be people like Mrs. Patterson, who saw your worth immediately. There will be children like Keme, who grow up knowing that love transcends the boundaries other people try to impose." Ayanna looked down at their joined hands. His large and calloused from years of ranch work, hers small and delicate, but equally strong in their own way. "You really believe this? That we can make good life together, despite everything?" "I believe that what we have found together is worth fighting for," Will said firmly. "I believe that the love growing between us is stronger than the fear and hatred of people who do not even know us. Most of all, I believe that Keme deserves to grow up in a home where he is cherished for exactly who he is, where he learns that a man's worth is measured by the content of his character, not the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth." At the mention of her son, Ayanna's expression softened. She looked down at Keme, who had abandoned his blocks to listen to their conversation with the solemn attention that made him seem older than his years. "Mama," the little boy said in his clear, sweet voice, "Papa will make us family? Real family?" The innocent question broke through the last of Ayanna's reservations. She knelt down to gather her son into her arms, then looked up at Will with eyes that shone with love and hope despite the tears that still clung to her lashes. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "We make real family." As Will gathered both Ayanna and Keme into his embrace, listening to the storm rage outside while feeling perfect peace within the circle of their shared love. He understood that this was what he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it. Not wealth or success or the approval of others, but this simple, profound connection to people who loved him not for what he owned, but for who he was in his heart. The storm would pass, as all storms do. But what they had built together would endure whatever challenges the world might bring. Summer settled over the Kansas prairie with a gentle warmth that seemed to bless the union Will and Ayanna had planned for the first week of July. Word of their engagement had spread throughout the territory, with the speed of wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from supportive curiosity to outright hostility. Will had expected as much, but he was gratified to discover that the friends worth keeping were those who judged Ayanna by her character rather than her heritage. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the circuit physician who had delivered half the children in 3 counties, offered to perform the ceremony. "I have seen enough of life to know that genuine love is rare and precious," he told Will. "Any man who would reject such a blessing because of prejudice is a fool." Mrs. Patterson threw herself into wedding preparations with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. "That girl has brought more joy to this house in 6 months than it has seen in 20 years, she declared, while helping Ayanna sew a wedding dress that blended white silk with traditional Apache beadwork in a pattern that honored both cultures, but perhaps the most touching support came from an unexpected source. Tom Wilson, Will's longtime foreman, arrived at the house one evening with his hat in his hands and a nervous expression on his weathered face. "Boss," he said awkwardly, "I got something to say, and I hope you will not take it wrong. I've been working for you 8 years now, and I seen how you was before. And how you been since Miss Ayana and the boy came to stay? Will tensed, prepared for another uncomfortable conversation about his choice of bride. Instead, Tom's face broke into a genuine smile. What I mean to say is, you've been a good boss all along, but now you are a good man too. That woman, she brought out something in you that was always there, but got buried under all that suspicion and loneliness. Any fool can see she makes you happy, and that little boy thinks you hung the moon. As far as I am concerned, anyone who got a problem with this wedding can take their opinions and ride south until they hit Texas. The ceremony itself took place in the garden behind the ranch house, beneath an arbor that Tom and the other ranch hands had constructed from native prairie flowers and cottonwood branches. As the sun set over the endless grassland, turning the sky into a canvas of gold and rose, friends and neighbors gathered to witness something unprecedented in their corner of Kansas, the marriage of a wealthy white rancher to an Apache woman. Ayana walked towards Onyawats, Will wearing the dress she and Mrs. Patterson had created together, her long black hair adorned with wildflowers and traditional Apache ornaments that caught the last rays of sunlight. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her eyes fixed on Will's face with an expression of love so pure it took his breath away. Kammy served as ring-bearer. His small chest puffed with pride as he carried the simple gold bands Will had ordered from the finest jeweler in Kansas City. The little boy had insisted on wearing his best clothes, a small suit that made him look like a miniature gentleman, though he had refused to remove the Apache bracelet his mother had made him from leather and beads. Dr. Morrison's words were simple but profound, speaking of love that transcended boundaries and the courage required to build a life together, despite the obstacles the world might place in their path. When it came time for vows, Will spoke from his heart, rather than from any prepared text. "Ayana," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "you came to my home as a stranger seeking shelter, and you leave here today as my wife in the center of my world. You have taught me that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give freely to those we love. I promise to honor your heritage, to protect our family, and to love you with all my heart, for all the days of my life." Ayana's vows were spoken in both Apache and English, her voice strong and clear despite the tears that glistened in her eyes. "Will," she said, "you gave me safety when I had none, hope when I had lost it, and love when I thought my heart was too broken to feel it again. I promise to stand beside you as your partner, to raise our children with pride in both their heritages, and to love you with the strength of the mountains and the endurance of the prairie grass." When Dr. Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled crowd included voices speaking in 3 different languages. Tom Wilson had convinced several neighboring ranchers to attend, and their presence, along with Mrs. Patterson's tearful joy and the enthusiastic celebration of the ranch hands, created an atmosphere of genuine community acceptance that exceeded Will's most optimistic hopes. The evening progressed with music, dancing, and a feast that Mrs. Patterson had been preparing for weeks. Will found himself marveling at how completely his life had been transformed. The man who had once trusted no one now found himself surrounded by people who had chosen to support his happiness despite social conventions that discouraged it. Later, as they danced under the stars while Kammy slept peacefully in Mrs. Patterson's arms, Ayana whispered in Will's ear, "Are you happy, husband? No regrets about Apache wife?" Will pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair and marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. "I have never been happier in my life," he said honestly. "You and Kammy are the greatest fortune I have ever acquired, and the only one that truly matters." As they swayed together in the warm Kansas night, surrounded by the sounds of celebration and the vast, star-filled sky, Will understood that he had finally found what he had been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but a sense of belonging, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful with another person. The walls around his heart had crumbled completely, replaced by something far stronger, the unshakable foundation of a family built on love, respect, and the courage to embrace a future together, regardless of what challenges it might bring.